In this lecture, we will be talking about communication between processes. So there might be several processes that are currently in our memory and they are concurrently being executed. So we would need a communication mechanism between the processes for a smooth operation. And there might be other advantages to achieve as well. So we'll first start talking about a distinction between two processes, one in which communication is does not play any role, for example, in the independent process, and for a cooperating process, communication is required. An independent process cannot affect or be affected by the execution of another process. So if there are several processes in our memory, one of them or some of them may be classified as independent if they cannot be affected by the others and they cannot affect other processes. In such case, communication is not required. It may be still present, but it is not going to be a key component. But for cooperating processes, on the other hand, these are the ones that can affect or be affected by the execution of another process. So over here, a mechanism for communication between those processes is definitely going to be required. Some of the advantages of process cooperation include information sharing, computation speed up, modularity and reuse, and convenience. So we'll go through this list by looking at some examples and discuss them in a little bit of detail. So for information sharing, for example, if two processes had to access the same shared file, for example, or it might be some shared data or information, then we would need a environment of communication so that that information sharing between those processes can happen. The next key advantage is computation speed up. So if it's a very complex task, we could decide to split it up into smaller subtasks or sub processes and assign those subtasks to multiple processors so that uh, the processors can work on them in parallel. By doing that, we get computation speed up. The third key advantage is modularity and reuse. So if we have an environment of process cooperation, then we can break down a very complex system design into smaller tasks or smaller blocks, meaningful modules, so that our design is modular. It's very easy to reuse. It is very easy to troubleshoot, and it's often the case where you break down a complex task into meaningful subtasks so that we can take advantage of a modular design as opposed to just one level design. The last advantage over here is convenience. Essentially, it is the advantage of multitasking. So if there are several processes that are in the memory, they are getting concurrently executed, they are all sharing the resources of the computer system. So it will be convenient for the users if those processes can communicate with each other to be able to share the resources. So multitasking or multiple processes getting concurrently executed is a key advantage that we obtain because of that communication mechanism in place. All of this information sharing requires a communication mechanism, and that mechanism is called inter-process communication, abbreviated as IPC. So let's take a look at what are some essential things in this mechanism IPC. We need to establish a link between the communicating processes. So over here we have two processes, process P and C, and if they need to communicate with each other, then we need to work on establishing a link so that communication can happen. And this link might look differently depending on which type of communication is happening between these processes. Um, the links may be unidirectional or bidirectional. Bidirectional is the one that is most common, and if we want to make it into a unidirectional link, we can also do that. For example, we use primitives, send and receive a Unix system called primitives to exchange data. So over here we see send and receive system calls which include the process ID of the process that they are trying to communicate with, followed by a message identifier. Many operating system specific variations may exist. It's not going to be necessarily this exact send and receive primitive as you see over here for Unix. There are two main approaches to IPC. On the left, we see a kernel that is being used. On the right over here, we see the kernel not playing a key role in that communication. So the one that is on the left is actually called message passing. And the one that is on the right is called shared memory. So inter-process communication that can happen using message passing and shared memory approaches. And as you can see, we have identified two processes, process A and B, in both these mechanisms. But for example, if process A needs to send something to process B, in message passing approach, process A using a mailbox or a port sends that message to the kernel, and the kernel in return passes that message to process B, and the kernel is sort of a mediator for that communication to happen. And obviously this is going to be slower because the kernel is going to have to facilitate that communication. And in the picture on the right, which is called shared memory, there is a memory space that is used as the shared memory space between process A and process B. This is typically assigned in the process A memory space because it is the one that is initiating that communication. So process A would write to that shared memory locations, and process B would then read from that memory location. And clearly over here, synchronization is going to be a very important issue. But on the left, when we do a message passing, the kernel is going to take care of that synchronization issue. And we'll take a look at the key differences between these two approaches on the next slide. So over here we have message passing approach on the left and the shared memory approach on the right. Some of these things that we have already discussed, messages passed between the processes go through the kernel, which consequently makes it a little bit slower because the kernel is in the picture here. It is going to be much simpler because there is no memory sharing. It is used for smaller amounts of data. Because it's slow, it's going to be for smaller amount of data. But a key difference between message passing and shared memory is message passing is the go-to approach for IPC in distributed systems. So for example, if we have multiple processes that are concurrently running on different computer systems that are connected on a network, then we do not have a shared memory space. In that case, we would have to use the message passing approach to pass messages from one process on one computer system to another process on a different computer system that are connected or distributed on a network. There can be two different types of communication in message passing. One is direct, where each process names the other explicitly, and there's an indirect communication in message passing that uses mailboxes or ports to communicate between processes. Coming to the shared memory approach to IPC, messages are exchanged through a shared region of memory. It is going to be much faster because the kernel is not involved. It is reserved for moving large amounts of data between processes. And as we discussed, because this requires a shared region of memory, it is going to be for those systems that are using one, that are not connected on a distributed network. They are local to one computer system. Uh, Shared memory usually in memory space of the initiating process. So if in the previous diagram process A was initiating the communication, so that shared space in the memory would be inside the process A memory space. Next we talk about bounded versus unbounded buffer that we are going to use in the form of shared memory. So the shared memory that is being used as the communication tool here, we can have two different types, bounded versus unbounded buffer. Um, and usually we talk about the producer consumer problem when we talk about the bounded versus unbounded buffer to explain that. So the producer consumer problem is a common paradigm for cooperating processes. For example, a web server that uses files and images which are consumed, that is read by the client web server requesting the resource. One solution to that producer consumer problem uses shared memory. So two types of buffers can be used, the bounded buffer versus the unbounded buffer. The unbounded buffer faces no practical limit on the size of the buffer. The consumer may have to wait for new items, but the producer can always produce new items in this case. And the consumer has to wait because if there is a queue or buffer that is getting filled up by the producer, um, the consumer will have to read all the messages that were sent ahead of time to be able to go to the new items that are being put in, or the new messages that are being put into that buffer space. The bounded buffer uses a fixed buffer size. In this case, the consumer must wait if the buffer is empty, and the producer must wait if the buffer is full. Let's go into the message passing approach to IPC. Um, if process P and Q wish to communicate, the operating system must offer a communication link. So this is sort of the first step. Establish a communication link between the process P and Q that wish to communicate with each other. There are several methods to logically, as opposed to physically implementing a link. We can use the send and receive primitives, system call, or operations to facilitate that logical link. The several methods include direct or indirect communication, and we can also classify them in a different way, synchronous or asynchronous communication. Synchronous is also called as blocking, and asynchronous is non-blocking communication. So we'll take a look at all these variations in just a bit. This is again message passing. We are not looking at the shared memory. We are focusing on the message passing approach. So this is message passing, and we are looking at the direct communication way or method to do the message passing between two processes. The processes must name each other explicitly. The keyword explicitly. Um, so to send message to process P, we would say send P message, and to receive a message from process Q, we would say receive Q message, where the message is sort of a message identifier. P and Q are the identifier for the processes. The properties of the communication link that are established using this direct communication approach, some of the properties are: links are established by the operating system. A link is associated with exactly one pair of communicating processes. The next one being, between each pair there exists exactly one link, and this link may be unidirectional but is usually bidirectional. Now, clearly, this is going to be a little bit slower because we are making sure that only one pair can communicate exactly one link. So there are lots of constraints over here. The disadvantage of this scheme is limited modularity of the resulting process definitions. Changing the identifier or the name of the process, for example, may necessitate examining or other process definitions and changing all the old reference identifiers to the new identifier. In general, any such hard coding technique where the identifiers must be explicitly stated are less desirable than the techniques involving indirection. Now let's take a look at indirect communication. Over here, messages are sent to and received from mailboxes. They're also called as ports. Each mailbox has a unique ID. Some of the properties of the communication link that fall in the category of indirect communication are: a link may be associated with many processes, as opposed to the previous one where there was a link only between process P and Q, only between a pair of processes. Each pair of processes may share several communication links because we can now have multiple mailboxes. Link may be unidirectional or bidirectional. To quickly summarize the indirect communication, we can say that a process can communicate with some other process via a number of different mailboxes. And two processes can communicate only if the process have a shared mailbox. So shared mailbox is sort of the key for this to happen. Let us see some operations and primitives that are used in indirect communication. So the operations: first create a new mailbox, then the processes that need to communicate, send and receive messages through that mailbox, and then the last one is to destroy the mailbox or close a port. The primitives used, again, send and receive. Over here we are using send message to mailbox A, then we are using receive as receive message from mailbox A. These are message identifiers that are pointing to the same mailbox, in this case mailbox A. So now let's talk about some properties of direct and indirect communication. So the first thing that we'll look at is synchronization. So um, whether we have a direct or indirect communication link, message passing may be either blocking or non-blocking. So we have two different types here: blocking versus non-blocking. Blocking is considered synchronous and non-blocking is considered asynchronous, and it is because of how they work. So for example, for blocking we have two primitives, the send and the receive, and also for non-blocking we have the same two primitives, send and receive system calls. So let's see what that blocking send, blocking receive, what are these. um, if the sending primitive is of blocking type, which it is over here, blocking send, the sending process is blocked until the message is received by the receiving process or by the mailbox if it is indirect communication. So, in other words, sender blocks until the message is received by the process that was supposed to be receiving. So, in the meantime, it just waits. And similarly, we can talk about the non-blocking send. Over here, the sender process or sending process sends a message and then does not wait for the message to be received. It just continues with its execution of the program. Um, so that's blocking send and non-blocking send. How does it look like on the receiver? So blocking receive, that means that the receiving process, the receiver, blocks until a message is available. So until it gets a valid message, it is going to keep blocking all the others. And a non-blocking receiver, over here the receive process receives a valid message, which is the good news, or if there is no valid message to receive, then it receives null. The next property of message passing is buffering. So this applies to both direct and indirect types of communication. Over here, messages reside in temporary queues, and we'll try to look at how buffering plays a role. So the buffering can be implemented in one of the three ways. We have zero capacity buffer, we have bounded capacity buffers, and we have unbounded capacity buffers. So in zero capacity, zero messages, sender must wait for receiver, which means that the queue has a maximum length of 0, meaning the link cannot have any messages waiting in it. In this case, the sender must block until the receiver receives the message. And we can also say that only one message can be sent at any given time. Both send and receive are blocking in this case. For bounded capacity, clearly the buffer is finite, so finite length of n messages. Over here, sender must wait if the link is full, which means that the sender must block until there is some space available in the temporary queue to accept new messages. The last buffering type is unbounded capacity, where we have an infinite length queue. Over here, sender never blocks, it just keeps getting the messages. Um, and the receiver is going to read that infinite length queue. However, we talked about the consequence of an unbounded buffer, which is that the receiver will have to wait for a long time to see new messages. Okay, so the next thing that we are going to talk in the next video is going to be pipes, and discuss some examples and all the details regarding how to use pipes to facilitate communication between two processes.